The rain came down like bullets that night, hitting the tin roof of David's cabin so hard he could barely hear his own thoughts. He sat by the old wood stove, warming his hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The cabin felt bigger when storms like this rolled through the mountains. Every creak of wood, every whistle of wind through the gaps in the walls reminded him just how alone he was out here. David had been living on the edge of the Pine Ridge Reservation for 3 years now. Not quite inside the community, not quite outside either. His grandmother had been Cherokee, but that quarter of blood didn't seem to count for much when it came to belonging anywhere. The people in town saw him as an Indian. The people on the reservation saw him as an outsider. He was stuck in the middle, like always. The thunder rolled overhead, shaking the small windows. David pulled his wool blanket tighter around his shoulders and tried to focus on the paperwork spread across his kitchen table. He worked as a freelance bookkeeper, helping small businesses keep their numbers straight. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and let him live out here in peace. Most days, peace was all he wanted. That's when he heard it. 3 sharp knocks on his front door. David froze. Nobody came out here at night, especially not in weather like this. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the dirt road leading to his cabin turned into a river of mud when it rained hard. He set down his coffee cup and listened. Maybe it was just a branch hitting the door or debris blown by the wind. Then he heard it again. 3 more knocks, definitely human, definitely urgent. David walked to the door, his bare feet cold on the wooden floor. He pressed his ear against the thick wood and heard something that made his heart skip. A woman's voice, barely audible over the storm, calling for help. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door and slowly turned the lock. The wind immediately tried to rip the door from his hands as he cracked it open. Rain sprayed into his face and he had to squint to see through the darkness. There, on his small covered porch, stood a young woman. She was soaked to the bone, her long black hair plastered to her face and shoulders. Her clothes were torn, and even in the dim light from his cabin, David could see she was injured. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, and she favored her right arm like it was hurt. "Please," she said, her voice shaking from cold or fear or both. "I need help. They're following me." David didn't hesitate. He dropped the bat and pulled the door wide open. "Get inside, hurry." The woman stumbled through the doorway, and David quickly closed the door behind her, turning both locks. She stood in his small living room, dripping water onto his old rug, looking around like a trapped animal. "It's okay," David said softly. "You're safe now." "My name is David. What's yours?" "Rain," she whispered. "My name is Rain." David grabbed some towels from the bathroom and handed them to her. "Here, dry off. I'll get the fire going stronger and make some hot tea." Rain wrapped one towel around her shoulders and used another to dab at the cut on her forehead. David busied himself adding wood to the stove and putting the kettle on. He snuck glances at her as he worked. She was young, maybe 25, with the high cheekbones and dark eyes of someone from the reservation. But there was something else in her face, something that made David's stomach tighten with worry. Fear. Pure, bone-deep fear. "Who's following you?" David asked as he pulled another chair close to the fire. Rain's eyes darted to the windows, then back to David. "Bad people. Dangerous people. They killed my friend because she found out about something she shouldn't have known." David felt ice form in his belly. "Killed? Rain, maybe we should call the police." "No." Rain grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "No police, not yet. They have people everywhere. I don't know who to trust." David nodded slowly. "Okay, no police tonight. But you're hurt. Let me take a look at that cut." He gently examined the wound on her forehead. It wasn't deep, but it needed cleaning. As he worked with hydrogen peroxide and bandages, Rain began to tell her story in fragments. She worked for the tribal council as a secretary. Her friend Linda had been an accountant there. Linda had discovered something in the financial records, something that would have destroyed several important people if it came out. Government money that was supposed to help the reservation was being stolen. Schools were falling apart. The clinic barely had supplies, and families were struggling while certain leaders got rich. Linda made copies of everything, Rain said, wincing as David cleaned her cut. Bank records, fake invoices, emails, everything. She was going to give it all to the FBI next week. What happened to her? Rain's eyes filled with tears. They made it look like an accident. Her car went off the mountain road during a snowstorm last week. But I know it wasn't an accident. I know because she gave me everything before she died. All the evidence. David's hand stilled. You have the evidence? Rain reached into her jacket and pulled out a small metal flash drive. Everything's on here. Names, dates, dollar amounts. Enough to send half the tribal council to prison. The kettle started whistling and David got up to make tea. His mind was racing. This woman had just brought something incredibly dangerous into his home. If what she was saying was true, and if these people really had killed once to protect their secret, they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Why did you come here? He asked, handing her a mug of hot tea. I mean, why my place specifically? Rain wrapped her fingers around the warm mug. Linda told me about you. She said you were someone who could be trusted, someone who wasn't part of any of the reservation politics. She said if anything happened to her, I should find you. David sat down heavily in his chair. Linda. He remembered her now. A quiet woman with kind eyes who had hired him last year to help with some personal tax issues. They had talked for hours about life on the reservation, about the struggles and the corruption that seemed to touch everything. He had liked her honesty. I'm so sorry about your friend, David said. Rain nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. She was good people. She really wanted to help make things better for everyone. And now she's gone and I'm the only one who knows the truth. Outside, the storm was starting to calm down. The rain had softened from bullets to drops and the thunder was moving away toward the next valley. But David felt like a bigger storm was just beginning. You can stay here tonight, he said. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do with that evidence. Maybe we can find someone in the FBI who can be trusted. Rain looked at him with something like hope in her eyes. You believe me? I believe you, David said. And I'm going to help you make sure Linda didn't die for nothing. As Rain curled up on his couch with blankets and pillows, David sat by the window looking out into the darkness. He had no idea that in just a few hours everything would change. He had no idea that by opening his door to help someone in need, he had just stepped into a trap that would brand him as a traitor to his own people. All he knew was that a scared young woman had asked for his help, and he couldn't turn her away. It was the right thing to do. Sometimes the right thing to do is exactly what gets you into the most trouble. David woke up at 5 in the morning to the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment he forgot about the night before and wondered who was in his kitchen. Then it all came rushing back. Rain, the storm, the flash drive full of dangerous secrets. He found her standing by the window looking out at the gray morning light. She had changed into some of his old clothes that he'd left out for her, and her hair was braided back neatly. The bandage on her forehead was clean and white. She looked better than she had the night before, but David could still see the tension in her shoulders. Couldn't sleep? He asked softly. Rain turned toward him. Every sound woke me up. I keep thinking they'll find me here. David poured himself a cup of coffee and joined her at the window. The world outside looked peaceful. Pine trees heavy with moisture from the storm. A deer picking its way carefully across the clearing. Mountains rolling away into the distance like sleeping giants. Tell me more about Linda, David said. How did she figure out what was happening? Rain sat down at the small kitchen table, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. She was always careful with money. Growing up poor does that to a person. When she started working for the tribal council 2 years ago, she noticed things didn't add up right. She explained how Linda had seen invoices for construction projects that never happened, medical supplies that never arrived at the clinic, and educational programs that existed only on paper. At first, Linda thought it was just bad record keeping. But the more she dug, the more she realized it was something much worse. The government sends millions of dollars every year to help our people, Rain said. Money for schools, healthcare, housing, job training. But most of that money was being stolen before it could do any good. David felt sick thinking about it. He had seen the conditions on the reservation. Kids going to school in buildings that should have been condemned years ago. Families living in trailers with broken windows and leaking roofs. Elderly people rationing their medicine because they couldn't afford to see a doctor. Who was taking the money? He asked. Rain pulled the flash drive from her pocket and set it on the table between them. The chairman of the tribal council, Robert Crow Dog, the treasurer, William Standing Bear, 3 other council members, even some people who aren't supposed to have access to the accounts. David recognized those names. Robert Crow Dog had been chairman for 8 years, always talking about progress and development for the reservation. William Standing Bear owned several businesses in the area and was considered one of the most successful native entrepreneurs in the state. How much money are we talking about? David asked. Over the past 5 years? Maybe $4 million. David nearly choked on his coffee. $4 million. That was enough to build new schools, fix roads, provide health care for everyone on the reservation for years. Instead, it had gone into the pockets of people who were supposed to be protecting their community. Linda spent months putting it all together. Rain continued. She made copies of everything. Bank records showing the money coming in from the government, fake invoices showing where it was supposed to go, real bank records showing where it actually went. She even recorded some phone calls between the conspirators. That's incredibly dangerous work, David said. She must have known what could happen if they found out. Rain's eyes filled with tears again. She knew, but she said someone had to stand up for the people. She said the kids deserved better. The elders deserved better. Everyone deserved better. David got up and made them both breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, bacon, simple food. But it felt good to do something normal while they talked about such heavy things. Rain ate like she hadn't had a meal in days, which made David wonder how long she'd been running. What happened the night Linda died? David asked gently. Rain was quiet for a long time, pushing eggs around on her plate. She called me that afternoon. Said she was scared. Someone had been asking questions about her work, going through her desk when she wasn't there. She thought they were getting suspicious. Linda had decided to take all the evidence to the FBI field office in Rapid City the next morning. She asked Rain to meet her early that evening to help her prepare everything. But when Rain got to Linda's house, her friend was gone. Her neighbor said Linda left in a hurry around 6 o'clock. She seemed upset, scared. Her car was found at the bottom of Pine Creek Canyon the next morning. The police said she must have hit black ice and lost control. But you don't believe that, David said. Linda grew up driving these mountain roads. She was careful, especially in winter, and there wasn't any ice that night. It had been warm for 3 days straight. Rain explained how she had searched Linda's house after the funeral, looking for the evidence her friend had gathered. She found most of it hidden in a box in Linda's basement, along with a note that mentioned David's name and address. The note said if anything happened to her, I should take everything to you. She said you were honest and you understood how the system worked. She trusted you. David felt a heavy weight settling on his shoulders. Linda had barely known him, but somehow she had decided he was someone who could be trusted with this dangerous secret. Now Rain was sitting in his kitchen, depending on him to help her expose the people who had killed her friend. What's your plan? David asked. I don't really have one, Rain admitted. I was hoping you would know what to do. David thought about it while he cleaned up the breakfast dishes. The smart thing would be to drive Rain to the FBI office in Rapid City and let them handle everything. But Rain was right to be worried about who could be trusted. Corruption cases were tricky, especially when they involved tribal governments and federal money. The wrong person could make the evidence disappear, or worse. I think we need to be very careful about who we approach, David finally said. Maybe we should make copies of everything first, hide them in different places. That way, if something happens to the originals, we still have backup. Rain nodded eagerly. That's smart. Linda always said to have backup plans. They spent the morning going through everything on the flash drive. David had to stop several times just to process what he was seeing. The scope of the theft was breathtaking. Money meant for school lunch programs had gone to pay for expensive cars. Healthcare funds had been used to buy vacation homes. Housing money had disappeared into personal bank accounts while families lived in poverty. This is enough evidence to put them all in prison for 20 years, David said. If we can get it to the right people without getting killed first, Rain replied. That afternoon, David drove to town to make copies of all the documents and buy some supplies. He told Rain to stay in the cabin with the doors locked. As he walked through the grocery store, he felt like everyone was watching him. Were these people part of the conspiracy? Did they know Rain was hiding at his place? When he got back to the cabin, Rain was pacing by the windows again. A truck drove by twice while you were gone, she said. Dark blue pickup with 2 men inside. They slowed down both times like they were looking at something. David felt his stomach drop. Did you recognize them? I couldn't see their faces clearly, but the truck looked familiar. I think it might belong to someone who works for the tribal council. David realized they were running out of time. If Rain had been right about Linda's death, and if the conspirators were now looking for the evidence, it wouldn't take them long to track Rain to his cabin. Her car was probably easy to trace, and David's connection to Linda would make him an obvious place to look. We need to get you somewhere safe, David said. And we need to get this evidence to the FBI as soon as possible. Where can I go? They have people everywhere on the reservation. And I can't go to the regular police because some of them are probably involved too. David made a decision that would change everything. You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow morning I'll drive you to Rapid City myself. We'll go straight to the FBI and turn over everything. Rain looked relieved for the first time since arriving at his door. Thank you, David. I don't know what I would have done without your help. As the sun set behind the mountains, David cooked dinner and tried to keep the conversation light. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every sound outside made him jump. Every shadow seemed suspicious. He had no way of knowing that the trap was already closing around them. The people Rain was trying to expose had been planning their next move since Linda's death. They knew about the evidence, and they knew Rain had it. Finding her at David's cabin was just a matter of time, and they had no intention of letting either of them live long enough to testify. David woke up to the sound of engines outside his cabin. Multiple vehicles getting closer. He checked the time on his phone and felt his blood turn cold. 6:30 in the morning. Nobody had legitimate business out here this early. He rolled out of bed quietly and moved to the window. Through the pine trees, he could see at least 3 vehicles coming up his dirt road. 2 police cars from the tribal police department and a dark SUV behind them. The same kind of vehicle that government officials used when they wanted to look important. Rain, he whispered urgently, moving toward the couch where she had been sleeping. The couch was empty. David's heart started pounding as he searched his small cabin. Kitchen, bathroom, bedroom. Nothing. Rain was gone, and so was the flash drive. The vehicles pulled into his clearing, just as David was trying to figure out what had happened. Car doors slammed, and he heard heavy boots walking across his porch. Then came the knock he had been dreading. David Brennan, this is Captain Joseph Two Hawks with the tribal police. We need to speak with you immediately. David threw on a shirt and pants, his mind racing. Where was Rain? Had she run during the night? Had someone taken her? And why were the police here now? He opened the door to find 5 men on his porch. 3 were in tribal police uniforms, including Captain Two Hawks, a man David recognized but had never spoken to. The other 2 wore expensive suits and serious expressions. Federal agents, probably FBI. Mr. Brennan, Captain Two Hawks said formally, we have a warrant to search your property in connection with the theft of federal funds intended for the Pine Ridge Reservation. David felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. I'm sorry, what? Theft of federal funds? I don't understand. One of the FBI agents stepped forward. Agent Collins, FBI. We received information that you have been working with certain individuals to embezzle money from tribal accounts. We need to search your cabin and ask you some questions. This couldn't be happening. Just 12 hours ago, David had been planning to help Rain take evidence to these same FBI agents. Now they were accusing him of being part of the conspiracy. There's been a mistake, David said. I'm not involved in any theft. I work as a bookkeeper for small businesses. I have nothing to do with tribal finances. We'll see about that, Captain Two Hawks said coldly. Step aside, please. David had no choice but to let them into his cabin. He watched helplessly as they began searching through his belongings. They went through his desk, his computer, his filing cabinets. One agent took his laptop while another photographed everything. Mr. Brennan, Agent Collins said, were you visited by anyone last night? David hesitated. If Rain had escaped, maybe it was better not to mention her. But if they already knew she had been here, lying would only make things worse. A woman came to my door during the storm, David said carefully. She said she needed help. I let her stay the night, but she was gone when I woke up. What was this woman's name? Captain Two Hawks asked. She said her name was Rain. I'd never met her before. The 2 FBI agents exchanged looks. Can you describe her? David gave them a basic description, leaving out any details about what Rain had told him. As he spoke, one of the tribal police officers called out from the kitchen, Captain, you need to see this. Everyone crowded into David's small kitchen. The officer was holding up a manila envelope that had been taped under David's kitchen table. David had never seen it before in his life. Agent Collins opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. Bank statements, financial records, and what looked like official tribal paperwork. David caught glimpses of dollar amounts in the thousands, account numbers, and dates going back several months. These appear to be records of unauthorized transfers from tribal education accounts. Agent Collins said, studying the papers. "Mr. Brennan, can you explain why these were hidden in your kitchen?" "I have no idea how those got there," David said, his voice rising with panic. "I've never seen those papers before. Someone must have planted them." Captain Two Hawks gave him a look that said he'd heard that excuse 1,000 times before. That's what they all say. The search continued for another hour. They found more evidence David had never seen before. A second flash drive hidden in his coffee tin, containing what appeared to be detailed records of the embezzlement scheme. Email printouts showing communication between David and several tribal council members about moving money around. Even a handwritten note in David's own writing, though he had no memory of writing it. With each discovery, David felt more trapped. Someone had been very busy setting him up, and they had done a thorough job. The evidence painted a clear picture of David as a key player in the conspiracy, the outside accountant who had helped steal millions of dollars from the reservation. "David Brennan," Captain Two Hawks said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government and theft of federal funds intended for Native American tribal assistance." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, David's mind reeled. This was impossible. Yesterday he had been a quiet bookkeeper living alone in the mountains. Today he was being arrested as a major criminal. "I want to call a lawyer," David said. "You'll get your phone call at the station," Captain Two Hawks replied. As they led him outside, David looked around his property with new eyes. Someone had been here, probably multiple times, planting evidence and setting up this trap. But when, and how had they known Rain would come to him? The worst realization hit him as they put him in the back of the police car. Rain's sudden appearance at his door hadn't been a coincidence. Her story about Linda and the evidence, the flash drive, even her fear of being followed. It had all been a setup. Rain had been working for the real criminals all along. Her job was to make David look guilty while protecting the people who were actually stealing the money. She had planted evidence throughout his cabin while he slept, then disappeared before the police arrived. But as they drove toward the tribal police station, David remembered something that didn't fit. The fear in Rain's eyes had been real. The tears when she talked about Linda had been genuine, and the evidence she had shown him on the flash drive had been detailed and convincing. What if Rain hadn't been working for the criminals? What if she had been telling the truth and someone else had discovered she was hiding at David's cabin? The more he thought about it, the more David realized there was a third possibility, one that made his blood run cold. What if Rain was dead, and the people who killed her had staged this whole arrest to cover their tracks? If Linda had been murdered for discovering the embezzlement, and if Rain had been killed for trying to expose it, then David was next. They couldn't just kill him outright without raising suspicion, but they could frame him as the mastermind behind the whole operation. He would go to prison, possibly for the rest of his life, while the real criminals walked free. At the tribal police station, David was booked and put in a small holding cell. He was allowed one phone call, but he realized he didn't know who to call. He didn't have money for a good lawyer, and he couldn't trust anyone connected to the reservation government. Hours passed. David sat on the hard bench in his cell, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rain's face. Was she really a betrayer, or was she another victim? Late that afternoon, Captain Two Hawks came to his cell with more bad news. "We found the woman who was staying with you," he said grimly. "Rain, is she okay?" "Her body was discovered this morning in Pine Creek Canyon, about 2 miles from here. Same place where Linda Crowfeather's car went off the road last week. Looks like another accident." David gripped the bars of his cell. "That's not an accident. Someone killed her just like they killed Linda." Captain Two Hawks studied David's face carefully. "How did you know Linda Crowfeather was dead? And how did you know her death wasn't an accident?" David realized he had just made a terrible mistake. In his shock about Rain's death, he had revealed information that only someone involved in the conspiracy would know. According to the official story, Linda's death had been ruled an accident. The woman who came to my door, she told me about Linda. She said Linda had been her friend." "Convenient story," Captain Two Hawks said, "but it doesn't explain how you knew the details of Linda's death, or why you have all that evidence in your cabin." As Captain Two Hawks walked away, David sank onto the bench and put his head in his hands. He was trapped in a web of lies and murder, and every word he spoke only made him look more guilty. The real killers had played this perfectly. They had eliminated 2 women who could have exposed their crimes, and they had set up David to take the blame for everything. By the time anyone figured out the truth, David would be in federal prison and the stolen millions would be long gone. But David had one advantage the killers didn't know about. He was completely innocent, which meant he had nothing to hide and nothing to lose by fighting back. The question was, how do you prove your innocence when everyone believes you're guilty? The news spread through Pine Ridge Reservation like wildfire in August. By noon, everyone knew that David Brennan had been arrested for stealing money meant to help their community. By evening, the story had grown into something much bigger and much worse. David sat in his jail cell listening to conversations in the hallway outside. Tribal police officers, FBI agents, and reservation officials came and went, each adding new details to his supposed crimes. According to what he was hearing, David wasn't just a thief. He was a traitor who had betrayed his own people for money. $4 million, one voice said. That's what he stole from us over 5 years. Money for our kids' schools, another voice added angrily. Medicine for our elders, housing for families living in cars, all gone into his pockets. I always knew there was something wrong with that guy, a third voice chimed in. Living out there alone, pretending to be one of us when he's only quarter Cherokee. His grandmother would be ashamed. David closed his eyes and tried to block out the words, but they cut deep. These people didn't know him personally, but they were ready to believe the worst about him. In their minds, he had already been tried and found guilty. The tribal council called an emergency meeting that evening. David could hear the crowd gathering outside the building, their voices carrying through the night air to the jail windows. Someone had set up speakers so everyone could hear the proceedings, and David found himself listening to his own character assassination. Chairman Robert Crow Dog spoke first, his voice heavy with disappointment and anger. My friends, we have been betrayed by someone we trusted. David Brennan came to our reservation claiming Cherokee blood, claiming to want to help our people. We welcomed him. We gave him work. Some of us even called him neighbor. The crowd murmured angrily. David had never realized how many people knew who he was or had opinions about him. But David Brennan was not our friend, the chairman continued. He was working with outside criminals to steal money that belonged to our children, our elders, our community. $4 million that should have built new schools, fixed our roads, and provided health care has disappeared into his accounts. Council member William Standing Bear spoke next. His voice was calmer but somehow more cutting. The evidence against David Brennan is overwhelming. FBI agents found detailed records in his home showing exactly how he moved our money into private accounts. They found communications between him and other criminals planning these thefts. They even found handwritten notes in his own writing, planning how to steal more. David wanted to scream that he had never written those notes, never sent those communications, never seen most of that evidence before it was found in his cabin, but no one would have heard him over the angry voices of the crowd. What makes this betrayal even worse, Standing Bear continued, is that David Brennan used his Cherokee blood to gain our trust. He claimed connection to our people, our history, our struggles, but he was nothing more than a con man using his grandmother's heritage to steal from her descendants. The crowd's anger was building. David could hear people shouting, calling for justice, demanding answers. Someone yelled that David should be banished from reservation land forever. Others suggested punishments that made David grateful he was safely locked up. But the most damaging testimony came from Captain Joseph Two Hawks of the tribal police. Based on our investigation, Captain Two Hawks announced, we believe David Brennan was the mastermind behind this conspiracy. He used his knowledge of bookkeeping and his connections to non-tribal lawyers to create a sophisticated scheme for stealing federal funds. We also believe he was responsible for the deaths of Linda Crow Feather and the woman known as Rain-Spotted Horse. Both women discovered evidence of his crimes and were killed to keep them quiet. The crowd gasped. David gripped the bars of his cell. Rain-Spotted Horse? He had never heard that last name before. And now they were saying he had killed both women? Captain Two Hawks continued his devastating testimony. Linda Crow Feather was an honest accountant who noticed irregularities in tribal finances. When she started investigating, David Brennan realized she was getting too close to the truth. Her death was staged to look like an accident. Rain's spotted horse was Linda's friend and co-worker. After Linda's death, Rain discovered evidence of the conspiracy. She went to David Brennan's cabin, probably thinking he was innocent and might help her. Instead, he killed her to protect his secret. David felt sick listening to this version of events. It was a complete fabrication, but it fit the evidence perfectly. The real criminals had planned this story carefully, making sure every detail supported their narrative. The crowd was now calling for David's head. Literally. Someone suggested traditional Cherokee justice for traitors. Others wanted him turned over to federal authorities for prosecution. A few voices called for him to be stripped of any claim to Cherokee heritage and banned from reservation land. Chairman Crow Dog called for calm, but his own words added fuel to the fire. David Brennan will face justice for his crimes, the chairman promised. But we must also learn from this betrayal. We must be more careful about who we trust with our community's welfare. We cannot let outsiders take advantage of our generosity again. As the meeting broke up, David heard the crowd dispersing outside his window. Some people were still angry, talking about what they would do to David if they got their hands on him. Others sounded defeated, talking about how this betrayal proved that things would never get better for their people. But David also heard a few different voices, quieter voices that asked questions the angry crowd didn't want to hear. "Something doesn't feel right about this," one elderly woman said. "I knew Linda Crowfeather since she was a little girl. She was smart, careful. If she suspected something, she would have gone straight to the FBI, not to some man she barely knew." "And what about the timing?" a man added. "All this evidence just happens to be found right after two women turn up dead? Why would David keep that stuff in his house if he was really guilty? Maybe we should wait for the trial before we decide he's guilty." Another voice suggested, "Remember what happened to Peter White Elk 10 years ago? Everyone thought he stole that construction money, but it turned out he was innocent." These voices were quickly shouted down by others who insisted the evidence was clear. But David held on to them like a lifeline. At least a few people on the reservation weren't ready to condemn him without a fair trial. Over the next few days, David's story became bigger news. Regional newspapers picked it up, describing him as a fake Cherokee who had infiltrated the reservation to steal from Native Americans. Television reporters showed up to interview tribal leaders about the betrayal. National news outlets began running stories about corruption on Indian reservations, using David's case as an example of how federal money intended to help Native Americans was being stolen by criminals posing as community members. David became the face of everything wrong with federal Indian policy. His photograph appeared in newspapers and websites across the country, usually with headlines about fraud, murder, and betrayal. The irony was crushing. David had spent his whole life feeling caught between two worlds, never fully accepted by either white or Native communities. Now he was being held up as the perfect example of why outsiders couldn't be trusted with tribal affairs. His court-appointed lawyer, a tired-looking man named Peterson who clearly wished he had been assigned a different case, visited David 3 days after his arrest. "I'm not going to lie to you, David," Peterson said, spreading case files across the small table in the jail's meeting room. "The evidence against you is extensive. Financial records, communications, physical evidence found in your home. The FBI has built what looks like a solid case. All of that evidence was planted," David insisted. "I never stole any money. I never hurt those women. I was trying to help them." Peterson looked skeptical. "Help them how?" David told him about Rain's visit, her story about Linda's discovery, of the embezzlement and the flash drive full of evidence. Peterson listened without interruption, taking notes but not looking convinced. "David," Peterson said when he finished, "that story makes you sound even more guilty. You're claiming that you had evidence of the crimes you're accused of committing. And that evidence just happened to disappear when the woman who brought it to you turned up dead. I know how it sounds, but it's the truth." "Truth and provable facts are two different things in court," Peterson replied. "Right now, the facts say you're guilty. Unless we can find something that proves someone else set you up, you're looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." That night, alone in his cell, David realized the full scope of what had been done to him. The real criminals hadn't just stolen money. They had created the perfect scapegoat, someone with just enough connection to the tribal community to be believable but not enough support to defend himself effectively. They had turned him into a symbol of everything the reservation community feared and hated. An outsider who had pretended to belong, who had used their trust against them, who had stolen their children's future for personal gain. And the most brilliant part of their plan was that it contained just enough truth to be believable. David really was an outsider. He really did have financial knowledge that could be used for. David had been in jail for a week when she first came to visit him. Betty Crowwing was 83 years old, moved slowly with a wooden cane, and had the sharpest eyes David had ever seen. She ran the reservation's small library and had known every family on Pine Ridge for 3 generations. "You didn't do it," she said without any introduction, settling carefully into the plastic chair across from David in the jail's visiting room. David looked at this tiny elderly woman with surprise. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching people lie for 8 decades and you don't have the face for it," Betty replied matter-of-factly. "Also because the story they're telling about you doesn't make sense to anyone who's paying attention." For the first time since his arrest, David felt a spark of hope. "What doesn't make sense?" Betty opened a small notebook filled with her careful handwriting. "Let's start with Linda Crowfeather. I knew that girl since she was 5 years old. Smart as a whip, careful with money, suspicious of everyone in authority. If she found evidence of stealing, she wouldn't have gone to some stranger she met once. She would have made copies, hidden them in multiple places, and contacted the FBI directly." David leaned forward eagerly. "That's exactly what Rain told me Linda was planning to do." "Rain-spotted horse," Betty said, shaking her head sadly. "That poor girl. I knew her too. She was scared of her own shadow most of the time, but she was loyal to her friends. If Linda trusted her with something important, Rain would have protected it with her life." "Do you think Rain was telling me the truth that night?" David asked. "I think Rain was telling you what she believed was the truth," Betty replied carefully. "Whether that's the same thing, I don't know yet." Betty had been doing her own investigation since David's arrest. As the reservation's librarian, she had access to old records, tribal documents, and most importantly, the trust of people who remembered how things used to be. "I started by looking at the money," Betty explained. $4 million over 5 years is a lot of cash to steal without anyone noticing. So I went back through the tribal council meeting minutes, budget discussions, financial reports that were supposed to be public. What she found was a pattern of missing information. Financial reports that should have been detailed were vague. Budget discussions that should have included specific numbers were full of general statements. Meeting minutes that should have recorded important votes were incomplete. "Someone has been very careful to keep the community from seeing exactly how much money comes in and where it goes," Betty said. "But they weren't careful enough to fool an old librarian who knows where all the records are kept." Betty had also been talking to people. Not the loud voices at the tribal council meeting, but the quiet ones who noticed things and remembered details. "Martha Two Bulls worked as a secretary for the tribal council until last year," Betty said, consulting her notes. "She told me Linda Crowfeather had been asking a lot of questions about old financial records. Martha thought Linda was just being thorough, but looking back she realizes Linda was investigating something specific." "What kind of questions?" David asked. "Questions about construction projects that were approved but never seemed to get built. Medical supply orders that showed up on budgets but never arrived at the clinic. Educational programs that were supposed to serve hundreds of kids but nobody ever saw. Martha had also noticed that certain council members always seemed to have new trucks, new houses, expensive clothes, even though their official salaries were modest. When she mentioned this to her supervisor, she was told to mind her own business and stick to typing letters. Martha quit her job 2 weeks before Linda died," Betty said. She said the atmosphere in the tribal offices had gotten strange. People were nervous, secretive. Important documents were being locked away instead of filed normally. Betty's investigation had also uncovered something else interesting. The timing of David's arrival on the reservation coincided almost exactly with when the embezzlement had begun. "You moved to Pine Ridge 5 years ago, right?" Betty asked. "That's when the money started disappearing. But you weren't the cause of the stealing. You were the solution to a problem the thieves already had." David didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Betty said patiently. These people had been stealing money for months, maybe years before you arrived. But eventually someone was going to notice. The FBI audits tribal finances every few years. Community members ask questions when promised improvements never happen. The criminals needed a fall guy, someone they could blame when the theft was discovered. David had been perfect for their needs. An outsider with financial skills, just Cherokee enough to have access to the community, but not Cherokee enough to have strong local support. They've been setting you up from the beginning, Betty said. Every time you did bookkeeping work for a tribal member, every time you attended a community meeting, every time you tried to be a good neighbor, they were building a case that would make you look guilty when the time came. David felt sick thinking about it. His attempts to find belonging in the community had been twisted into evidence of criminal conspiracy. But why kill Linda and Rain? David asked. If I was supposed to be the fall guy, why not just let me take the blame without hurting anyone? Because Linda was too smart and too honest, Betty replied. She found real evidence, not the fake evidence they planted in your house. If she had lived to testify, she could have proven your innocence and exposed the real criminals. And Rain was a loose end. She knew Linda's real evidence existed. Maybe she even knew where Linda hid it. They couldn't risk her talking to the right people. Betty closed her notebook and looked directly into David's eyes. David, I believe you're innocent. But believing and proving are two different things. We need help. That help came from an unexpected source 2 days later. Agent Rebecca Martinez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit arrived at the reservation to take over the case from the local agents. She was young, sharp, and had a reputation for finding the truth, even when powerful people didn't want it found. Agent Martinez came to see David on her second day at Pine Ridge. Unlike the other FBI agents who had questioned him, she didn't seem convinced of his guilt. Mr. Brennan, she said, sitting across from him in the same visiting room where he had met Betty, I've been reviewing your case file, and I have some questions. I'll answer anything you want to know, David said eagerly. The evidence against you is extensive, but it's also very convenient, Agent Martinez said. Financial records found exactly where they would be discovered. Communications that clearly implicate you but don't show how you learned the account numbers you supposedly used. Physical evidence that appears to have been placed rather than naturally accumulated. David felt another spark of hope. You think someone planted the evidence? I think someone wanted this case to be solved quickly and quietly, Agent Martinez replied. The question is why? Agent Martinez had been asking the same questions Betty had been asking, but with federal resources behind her investigation. She had access to banking records, phone logs, travel records, and other information that showed a more complex picture than the local investigation had revealed. The money trail is interesting, she said, consulting her own notes. The stolen funds went into accounts that were supposedly yours, but the money didn't stay there. It was transferred almost immediately to other accounts in other banks, sometimes in other states. I don't have accounts in other states, David said. I barely have enough money for one account right here. I know. I've seen your real financial records. You live paycheck to paycheck just like you claim, but someone wanted it to look like you were receiving large payments for criminal services. Agent Martinez had also noticed something else. The timeline of the supposed crimes didn't match David's actual activities and whereabouts. According to the evidence, you were receiving payments and sending instructions to co-conspirators on dates when I can prove you were somewhere else entirely, she said. Your cell phone records, credit card receipts, even library checkout records show you were living your normal routine while these crimes were supposedly happening. But the most interesting discovery had come from the forensic analysis of the evidence found in David's cabin. The documents found in your house were definitely planted there recently, Agent Martinez said. The paper is too clean, the ink is too fresh, and there are no fingerprints on them except those of the officers who found them. If you had been handling these documents for months or years, they would show wear and tear, coffee stains, natural aging. So you believe me? David asked, hardly daring to hope. I believe someone worked very hard to make you look guilty, Agent Martinez replied. Now I need to figure out who did it and why, and how to prove it. Agent Martinez had one more piece of information that changed everything. Linda Crow Feather wasn't the only person investigating tribal finances, she said. 3 months ago, she contacted my office directly. She said she had evidence of embezzlement but needed time to gather more proof before making a formal complaint. David's heart raced. Did she give you any evidence? She was supposed to meet with me the week she died. She never made it to the appointment, but she did send an email the day before she died. Agent Martinez found Linda's hidden evidence on a cold Thursday morning, buried in a coffee can under the floorboards of her grandmother's abandoned house. Betty Crow Wing had suggested the location after, remembering how Linda used to hide her childhood treasures there when she was scared of her older brothers. The evidence was devastating. David sat in the FBI field office conference room, finally released on bail thanks to Agent Martinez's investigation, watching as she spread out Linda's real discoveries across a long table. Bank statements, photographs of documents, audio recordings, and a detailed written timeline that showed exactly how the embezzlement scheme worked. Linda was incredibly thorough, Agent Martinez said, handling each piece of evidence carefully. She documented everything over 8 months. Names, dates, amounts, methods. She even recorded several phone conversations between the conspirators. The truth was worse than anyone had imagined. The embezzlement scheme involved not just tribal council members, but also employees at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, contractors who submitted fake invoices, and even some FBI agents who were supposed to oversee tribal finances. Chairman Robert Crow Dog was the ringleader, Agent Martinez explained, pointing to financial records that showed money flowing into his personal accounts. But he couldn't have done this alone. He needed help from people in the federal government who could approve funding requests, and people in the tribal government who could authorize payments. William Standing Bear, the tribal treasurer, had been Crow Dog's main partner. Together, they had created an elaborate system of fake construction projects, non-existent medical supply purchases, and phantom educational programs. Money would be approved for these projects, transferred to tribal accounts, then immediately moved to private accounts controlled by the conspirators. Over 5 years, they stole nearly $6 million, Agent Martinez said, not $4 million like they claimed in court. They've been lying about the amount to make their crime seem smaller. But the most shocking discovery was how they had planned to frame David from the very beginning. Listen to this, Agent Martinez said, playing an audio recording Linda had made secretly. The voices on the recording were clear. Chairman Crow Dog and Captain Two Hawks discussing their insurance policy. That bookkeeper guy, Brennan, he's perfect, Crow Dog's voice said. Just Cherokee enough to have access, but not Cherokee enough for people to really trust him. When this thing eventually gets discovered, we point the finger at him. How do we make it stick? Captain Two Hawks asked. Easy. We've been saving documents, creating a paper trail. Every few months, we plant a little more evidence in his house. By the time we're ready to shut this down, it'll look like he's been the mastermind all along. David felt sick listening to his life being planned and manipulated by people he had never even met personally. The recording continued with more details about their plan. They had been monitoring David's activities, knew his routines, even knew about his friendship with Linda before she became suspicious of their crimes. The beauty of it, Crow Dog continued on the recording, is that even if some people suspect we're involved, they'll never be able to prove it. All the evidence will point to Brennan. And if anyone gets too close to the truth, they have accidents, Captain Two Hawks finished grimly. Agent Martinez stopped the recording. Linda made this recording 6 weeks before she died. She suspected she was in danger, which is why she hid everything so carefully. Betty Crow Wing, who had been listening quietly in the corner of the room, spoke up. Those men killed Linda and Rain to protect themselves, and they would have let David go to prison for the rest of his life. They still might, Agent Martinez warned. We have evidence of their crimes, but they don't know we have it yet. If they find out their plan is falling apart, they might try to run or destroy more evidence. The investigation had revealed something else important. Rain-Spotted Horse had been telling David the truth that stormy night. She really was Linda's friend, and she really had been trying to expose the conspiracy. But the criminals had discovered her plan and decided to use her as bait to complete their frame job against David. They probably threatened Rain's family to force her cooperation. Agent Martinez explained. Made her go to David's cabin with just enough real evidence to seem credible. Then they killed her and planted fake evidence to make David look guilty of her murder too. So Rain was a victim, not a criminal, David said, feeling relief mixed with sadness. She was trying to honor her friend's memory by getting justice, Betty added. Those monsters used her grief and loyalty against her. Agent Martinez had spent 2 weeks building a case against the real criminals. She had traced the stolen money through multiple bank accounts, interviewed dozens of people who had noticed suspicious activities, and gathered enough evidence to prosecute everyone involved. But she was worried about making arrests too early. If we move against them now, they might have time to destroy more evidence or intimidate witnesses, she said. We need to catch them in the act of something they can't deny. That opportunity came sooner than expected. Betty's network of reservation informants had been watching the tribal offices since David's arrest. They noticed increased activity in the building late at night, people coming and going with boxes, documents being shredded after hours. They're cleaning house, Betty reported, getting rid of anything that might connect them to the real crimes. Agent Martinez decided to act. Working with honest tribal police officers and federal agents she trusted, she obtained warrants to search the tribal offices and arrest the main conspirators. The raid happened at dawn on a Friday morning. David watched from Agent Martinez's car as FBI agents and U.S. Marshals surrounded the tribal council building. Chairman Crow Dog arrived for work to find federal agents waiting in his office with handcuffs. Captain Two Hawks tried to run when he saw the agents, but they caught him in the parking lot. William Standing Bear surrendered without resistance, looking like he had been expecting this day for years. But the most satisfying arrest was saved for last. Agent Martinez had discovered that Bureau of Indian Affairs supervisor Harold Peterson had been the federal connection that made the scheme possible. He had approved fraudulent funding requests and helped move stolen money through government accounts. Peterson was arrested at his home in Rapid City, still in his pajamas, trying to delete files from his computer when federal agents broke down his door. 7 people arrested in connection with the Pine Ridge embezzlement conspiracy, Agent Martinez told David as they drove back to town. We recovered $4.3 million from various accounts, and we're still tracking down the rest. David felt overwhelming relief, but also anger at what had been done to him and the 2 innocent women who had died. What happens now? He asked. Now we prepare for trial, Agent Martinez replied. Your charges will be dropped, obviously. You'll probably want to file civil lawsuits against the people who falsely accused you, and the reservation will need new leadership to rebuild trust with the community. As news of the arrests spread through Pine Ridge, the reaction was mixed. Some people were angry that they had been lied to about David's guilt. Others were embarrassed that they had been so quick to believe the worst about him. A few still insisted that David must have been involved somehow, even though the evidence clearly showed his innocence. But the strongest reaction came from the families who had suffered while their money was being stolen, parents whose children attended schools with leaking roofs and broken windows, elders who had gone without proper medical care, families who had lived in substandard housing while millions of dollars meant to help them disappeared into private accounts. Those people didn't just steal money, Betty said as they watched the news coverage together. They stole hope. They stole the future our children deserved. They stole trust between community members. David understood now why Linda Crowfeather had been willing to risk her life to expose the conspiracy. It wasn't just about money. It was about justice for people who had been forgotten and neglected while their leaders got rich. Linda and Rain didn't die for nothing, David said. Their sacrifice is going to help their people get the justice they deserved. But as he watched the news reports and listened to community reactions, David also realized something else. Even though his name had been cleared, even though the real criminals were in jail, his life would never be the same. Too many people had believed he was guilty. Too many harsh words had been spoken. Too much damage had been done to relationships and trust that might never be fully repaired. The frame job had failed to send him to prison, but it had accomplished something almost as destructive. It had branded him as an outsider who could never truly be trusted, even when proven innocent. David was free, but he wasn't sure if he could ever really come home. The first attempt on David's life came 3 days after the arrests. He was walking back to his cabin from town, carrying groceries and trying to adjust to being free again, when a pickup truck came racing down the mountain road directly toward him. David dove into the ditch just as the truck swerved to follow him, missing him by inches before speeding away. Agent Martinez found David sitting by the side of the road. Shaken but unhurt. Did you see who was driving? she asked, helping him gather his scattered groceries. The windshield was tinted too dark to see inside, David replied. But that wasn't an accident. They were trying to kill me. We arrested the main players, but conspiracies like this have tentacles, Agent Martinez said grimly. There are probably people we don't know about yet, people who want to keep you quiet. That night, Agent Martinez moved David to a safe house in Rapid City. It was a small apartment above a diner, watched by federal agents around the clock. David felt like a prisoner again, but at least he was a living prisoner. Betty Crow Wing was also in danger. Someone had broken into her house while she was at the library, searching through her papers and clearly looking for something specific. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. Stop digging or face consequences. I'm 83 years old, Betty told Agent Martinez defiantly. If these criminals want to threaten me, they can get in line behind arthritis, diabetes, and high blood pressure. I'm not backing down. But Agent Martinez insisted on protection for Betty, too. The elderly librarian was moved to a secure location, much to her annoyance. I've lived on this reservation my entire life, Betty complained. Now I'm hiding in a motel room in Sioux Falls because some thieves don't want to face justice. This is not how my story is supposed to end. The threats escalated over the next week. David's cabin was burned down while he was in protective custody. The fire started at 3 a.m. and consumed everything he owned. The local fire chief ruled it arson, but said there wasn't enough evidence to determine who was responsible. Agent Martinez's car tires were slashed while she attended a meeting with federal prosecutors. A note left on her windshield read, "Drop the case or join your witnesses." Betty's grown son received phone calls warning him that his mother would have an accident if she testified at trial. When he tried to convince Betty to leave the state until the trial was over, she refused. My grandfather fought cavalry soldiers to protect this land, Betty said. My father fought to keep our language and culture alive when the government tried to destroy them. I'm not going to be scared off by some corrupt politicians who think they can murder their way out of consequences. The real criminals weren't just trying to silence witnesses. They were also working to undermine the case against them from inside the justice system. Agent Martinez discovered that someone was feeding information about her investigation to the defendant's lawyers. Details about witness testimonies, evidence locations, and investigative strategies were being shared with the very people they were trying to prosecute. We have a leak somewhere in law enforcement, she told David during one of her visits to the safe house. Someone is working for the other side. The leak became obvious when David's safe house location was discovered. He woke up one morning to find a sniper's bullet hole in the window 6 inches from where his head had been on the pillow. If he hadn't gotten up early to use the bathroom, he would have been killed. Agent Martinez moved David again, this time to a location she didn't share with anyone else in law enforcement. But she was running out of places to hide him, and the trial was still months away. They're going to keep trying until they succeed, David said, during a tense meeting in yet another anonymous motel room. Maybe I should just disappear. Leave the state, change my name, start over somewhere else. If you disappear, the case falls apart, Agent Martinez replied. Your testimony is crucial to proving the conspiracy. Without you, some of these criminals might go free. What good is my testimony if I'm dead? Betty, who was present for the meeting via secure video call from her own safe location, spoke up with characteristic bluntness. David, those men killed Linda and Rain to protect their secret. If we let them scare us into silence, Linda and Rain died for nothing. Is that what you want? David knew she was right, but the constant fear was wearing him down. He couldn't sleep without nightmares about pickup trucks and burning cabins. He couldn't eat without wondering if someone had poisoned his food. He couldn't trust anyone except Agent Martinez and Betty, and even they couldn't protect him from everything. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the corrupt tribal council members, facing 30 years in federal prison, decided to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence. Victor Crow Dog, the chairman's younger brother, revealed the full scope of the conspiracy during a series of debriefing sessions with Agent Martinez. There are 12 people involved, Victor said, his voice shaking as he betrayed his own family, not just the ones you arrested. There are others, people with connections to organized crime, people who can make problems disappear permanently. Victor explained how the conspiracy had connections to drug trafficking operations on several reservations, money laundering schemes in 3 states, and corrupt officials in Washington, D.C. The Pine Ridge embezzlement was just one part of a much larger criminal enterprise. My brother Robert isn't the boss, Victor revealed. He takes orders from someone in Chicago, someone with connections to politicians and federal judges. That's why they're so confident they can beat this case. Agent Martinez realized they weren't just dealing with local corruption. They were up against a sophisticated, criminal organization with resources and connections that reached far beyond the reservation. This explains why they've been so aggressive about silencing witnesses, she told David. This isn't just about hiding embezzlement. It's about protecting a multi-million-dollar criminal operation. With Victor's cooperation, Agent Martinez began mapping the full criminal network. She identified the mysterious Chicago connection as Anthony Battaglia, a businessman with ties to organized crime and legitimate investments in Native American casinos and construction companies. Battaglia had been using tribal governments across the Midwest to launder money from various illegal operations. He would arrange for federal grants to be approved for fake projects, then use tribal officials to transfer the money through accounts he controlled. The embezzled funds would emerge clean on the other end, invested in legitimate businesses. Robert Crow Dog was just a middle manager in this operation, Agent Martinez explained to David and Betty during a secure conference call. But Battaglia can't afford to let him testify because Robert knows too much about the whole network. This revelation changed everything. The attempts on David's life weren't just about covering up local corruption. They were about protecting a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. No wonder they're willing to kill to keep this quiet, Betty said. We stumbled into something much bigger than we realized. Agent Martinez made a difficult decision. Instead of waiting for the scheduled trial, she convinced federal prosecutors to move up the timeline and seek immediate indictments against the entire network. We're going to hit them all at once, she explained. Coordinated arrests in 4 states, targeting everyone from the tribal officials to the Chicago money laundering operation. If we give them too much time to react, they'll destroy evidence and eliminate more witnesses. But the coordinated raids required careful planning and absolute secrecy. Agent Martinez couldn't trust anyone in local law enforcement with the details. She had to work directly with FBI headquarters and U.S. attorney offices in multiple states. As the date for the raids approached, the attempts on David's and Betty's lives intensified. Someone tried to poison Betty's food at the safe house. A car bomb exploded in the parking lot of David's motel, destroying the wrong vehicle but sending a clear message. They know something is coming, Agent Martinez said during their final planning meeting. They're getting desperate. David felt the weight of 2 women's deaths on his shoulders. Linda and Rain had died trying to expose this conspiracy. If he backed down now, if he let fear win, their sacrifice would be meaningless. When do we move? He asked. Tomorrow at dawn, Agent Martinez replied. By this time tomorrow, either we'll have broken up this criminal network, or we'll all be dead. As David tried to sleep in yet another anonymous motel room, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. 2 weeks ago, he had been a lonely man living quietly on the edge of a reservation, trying to find where he belonged. Now he was at the center of a battle between justice and corruption that would determine the fate of entire communities. He had opened his door to help a scared woman on a stormy night. That simple act of kindness had pulled him into a web of murder and betrayal that reached from Pine Ridge to Chicago. Tomorrow would determine whether that act of kindness would lead to justice or just more graves. The coordinated raids began at exactly 6 a.m. across 4 states. David watched from a secure observation post as FBI agents surrounded buildings in Chicago, Denver, Minneapolis, and 3 different reservations. Years of planning and corruption were about to come crashing down. Agent Martinez spoke into her radio from the command post they had set up outside Pine Ridge. All units, this is Phoenix 1. Execute, execute, execute. David felt his heart pounding as he watched federal agents move into position around the tribal council building. This was the moment that would either vindicate Linda and Rain's sacrifice or see the criminals escape justice one final time. The first arrest went smoothly. William Standing Bear was taken into custody at his home without resistance, still in his bathrobe and looking like he had been expecting this day for months. He had clearly given up any hope of avoiding prison, but Chairman Robert Crow Dog was nowhere to be found. His house is empty, came the radio report from the team sent to arrest him. Looks like he cleared out in a hurry. Clothes missing, safe cleaned out, no sign of him or his family. Agent Martinez cursed under her breath. He must have gotten wind of the operation somehow. Put out an APB on his vehicle and notify airport security. The arrests in other states were more successful. Anthony Battaglia, the Chicago crime boss who had been orchestrating the money laundering operation, was caught at his downtown office trying to destroy computer files. Federal agents had to break down his door while he was feeding documents into an industrial shredder. Phoenix 1, this is Chicago team, came the radio report. Primary target in custody. We recovered 4 computers and approximately 200 boxes of financial documents before he could destroy them. Similar successes were reported from Denver and Minneapolis. Federal agents arrested corrupt BIA officials, crooked contractors, and several tribal leaders who had been part of the conspiracy. In total, 23 people were taken into custody in the coordinated operation. But Robert Crow Dog remained at large. He's the one who can identify all the other players we haven't found yet. Agent Martinez explained to David as they watched the operation unfold. Without him, parts of this network might survive. The manhunt for Crow Dog continued throughout the day. His credit cards were frozen, his bank accounts were monitored, and his photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country, but he had vanished completely. Then Betty Crow Wing made a suggestion that changed everything. Robert has a hunting cabin up on Bear Mountain, she told Agent Martinez during a secure phone call. It's been in his family for generations. No electricity, no phone lines, but there's a good road up there. If he's trying to hide somewhere familiar while he figures out how to escape, that's where he'd go. Agent Martinez assembled a team to check the cabin. David asked to go along, and after some argument, she agreed. You've earned the right to see this through to the end, she said, but you stay in the vehicle until we secure the area. The drive up Bear Mountain took 40 minutes on winding dirt roads. David's stomach tightened as they climbed higher into the pine forest where this whole nightmare had begun. He kept thinking about that stormy night when rain had knocked on his door, carrying secrets that would change everything. The cabin sat in a small clearing near the top of the mountain. Smoke was rising from the chimney and a familiar pickup truck was parked outside. That's Crow Dog's vehicle, Agent Martinez confirmed, studying the scene through binoculars. Looks like Betty was right. The arrest team moved carefully through the trees surrounding the cabin. Robert Crow Dog had clearly chosen this location because it was defensible, with good sight lines in all directions and only one approach road. But he had also trapped himself. There was nowhere to run from the mountaintop except down the same road the FBI had used to reach him. Agent Martinez used a bullhorn to call out to the cabin. Robert Crow Dog, this is the FBI. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands visible and surrender peacefully. For several minutes there was no response. Then the cabin door opened slowly. Robert Crow Dog stepped onto the porch, but he wasn't surrendering. Instead, he was holding a rifle and wearing a bulletproof vest. I'm not going to prison for something that was never supposed to hurt anyone, he shouted across the clearing. This was about survival, about making sure our people had resources when the government abandoned us again. Agent Martinez tried to negotiate with him through the bullhorn, but Crow Dog was clearly desperate and possibly unstable. He fired several shots into the air, then retreated back into the cabin. He's not coming out peacefully, Agent Martinez told her team over the radio. Prepare for a siege situation. The standoff lasted 6 hours. Crow Dog alternated between shooting at federal agents and shouting justifications for his crimes. He claimed he had only been trying to help his people, that the government money was being wasted anyway, that he deserved compensation for years of thankless service to the tribal community. But his words rang hollow across the mountain clearing. Everyone knew the truth now. The stolen money hadn't helped anyone except the criminals who took it. As afternoon turned to evening, Crow Dog's situation became hopeless. Federal agents had surrounded the cabin completely, cutting off any escape routes. Helicopters circled overhead. Negotiators had been trying to talk him into surrendering peacefully, but he refused to listen. Then, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, something unexpected happened. Betty Crow Wing's voice came over the FBI radio, clear and strong despite her 83 years. Agent Martinez, this is Betty. I'm on my way up the mountain. Don't try to stop me. Agent Martinez grabbed her radio. Betty, absolutely not. This is a dangerous situation. You need to stay at the safe house. That man killed 2 young women and destroyed David's life to cover up his crimes, Betty replied. He betrayed his own people for money. As an elder of this community, I have something to say to him. Before anyone could stop her, Betty's old pickup truck came rumbling up the mountain road. She parked it between the FBI vehicles and the cabin, then got out slowly, using her wooden cane for support. Robert Crow Dog, she called out in a voice that carried across the clearing like thunder. This is Betty Crowwing. I knew your grandmother. I knew your mother. I watched you grow up in this community. Come out here and face what you've done. For the first time in hours, the shooting stopped. Crow Dog appeared in the cabin doorway, his rifle lowered. Mrs. Crowwing, he called out uncertainly. You shouldn't be here. This isn't about you. This is about all of us, Betty shouted back. You stole money meant for our children's education. You stole money meant for medical care for our elders. You stole hope from families who trusted you to lead them. Betty began walking slowly across the clearing toward the cabin, leaning heavily on her cane. Agent Martinez started to follow her, but Betty waved her back. Let me talk to him, Betty said firmly. Elder to elder, leader to leader, Cherokee to Cherokee. David watched from the FBI vehicle, amazed by the courage of this tiny old woman facing down an armed and desperate criminal. Betty represented everything good about the tribal community that Crow Dog had betrayed. Robert, Betty said, now close enough to the cabin that she didn't need to shout. Your grandmother Sarah would be ashamed of you. She spent her whole life fighting to preserve our culture and protect our people. You've dishonored everything she stood for. Crow Dog's rifle wavered in his hands. Mrs. Crowwing, you don't understand. The government was never going to give us what we needed. I had to take what I could get, by murdering innocent women, by framing an innocent man, by stealing from the poorest families on the reservation. Betty's voice was full of disappointment and anger. That's not leadership, Robert. That's betrayal. Linda was going to destroy everything, Crow Dog said desperately. She would have sent us all to prison. The programs would have been shut down. People would have lost their jobs. What programs? Betty demanded. What jobs? You stole the money before it could create any programs or jobs. Children are still going to school in buildings that leak. Elders are still choosing between medicine and food. Families are still living in trailers that should have been condemned years ago. David could see Crow Dog's resolve cracking. The weight of his crimes, the futility of his situation, and Betty's moral authority were breaking down his defenses. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, Crow Dog said, his voice cracking. It just got out of control. You had a choice every step of the way, Betty replied. When you took the first dollar, you chose greed over duty. When Linda discovered your crimes, you chose murder over confession. When Rain tried to get justice for her friend, you chose to frame David rather than take responsibility. Betty was now standing at the bottom of the cabin steps, looking up at the man who had brought so much pain to their community. It ends now, Robert. Come down here and surrender. Face the consequences of your choices like a man. Don't add the shame of dying as a coward to all the other shame you've brought on your family name. For a long moment, Crow Dog stood frozen in the cabin doorway. David held his breath, wondering if this confrontation would end in more violence. Then slowly, Crow Dog set down his rifle and raised his hands. I surrender, he said quietly. FBI agents moved in quickly to take him into custody.